Welcome to the dreams of history. Every 12,000 years, the planet turns a page. In that turning, there is a silence so absolute that entire cities, entire languages, entire ways of knowing can be swallowed without a trace. We call these moments calamities or ice ages or floods. The ancients called them endings and beginnings in the same breath. To them, time was not a straight line, but a wheel, and the wheel moved in rhythms the modern mind has only begun to notice. If we slow ourselves down and listen, not to the noise of our present, but to the whispers embedded in stone, in clay, and in the bones beneath the earth, we can feel the pulse of that turning. It beats under glaciers and beneath deserts, in the lattices of pyramids and the aligned stones of temples, whose builders looked upward as if they expected the sky to answer them. Imagine for a moment a coast that is no longer there. Imagine people waking to a morning much like ours and discovering, within a single season, that the sea has climbed where wheat once grew. Imagine great cities, with their courtyards and markets and libraries, not falling to ruin over centuries but wrenched from the map in decades, in years, in a fierce and sudden rearrangement of climate and sea. When the last great thaw came at the end of the Ice Age, meltwater rose into oceans with a speed that astonishes us now only because we measure on a different clock. Ice that had knelt above coastal towns collapsed. Shorelines redefined themselves. Communities built on knowledge of tides and stars found that the map they trusted no longer matched the world at all. Those who survived rebuilt on higher ground and invented new myths to explain what they had lost. Those myths travelled, sometimes across continents, sometimes across millennia, and wherever they landed, they took on the character of the land and the language of the people. Floods became deluges. Deluges became stories of divine anger, of cleansings, of fresh starts. Yet underneath those stories there is a single, repeating motif, a catastrophe that resets the conditions of life, followed by a slow, tenacious rebuilding of human order. There are places on Earth where the sea has kept the traces for us, quietly and evenly. There are stone steps submerged beneath tropical water and streets laid out under silt, and in those places, archaeology meets the sea, and the two tell the same story. They tell us that we are not the first to be surprised by the speed at which the world can change. They tell us that a civilization's loss does not always end the technical or spiritual knowledge it carried. Sometimes it is preserved in ritual, sometimes in architecture, sometimes in the alignment of stone with star, and sometimes, like a pressed seed, it lies dormant until a later age chooses to remember it without quite understanding why. There is a curious mathematical rhythm to this turning. Scholars and myth keepers alike have noticed it, not as a neat prophecy, but as a pattern in the accumulation of evidence. Geological cores pulled from deep ice, layers of sediment that read like the rings of a giant tree, hold signatures of abrupt swings in climate and chemistry. Those signatures cluster in ways that imply pulses rather than smooth, gradual drift. When we look outward into the sky itself, we find that the sun and the galaxy are not immutable background wallpaper, but actors in a vast clockwork whose hands pull on our planet in cycles. Solar storms, shifts in cosmic radiation, celestial bodies altering their path just slightly. All of these can conspire with terrestrial shifts to produce sudden calamity. The ancients described some of these events in language that entwined observation with metaphor, comets as burning swords, rains that overturned the world, nights so dark the stars seemed to shift. Later, science would give names to parts of that story. Younger Dryas, meltwater pulses, magnetic excursions. The vocabulary changed, but the underlying sequence, catastrophe, collapse, recovery, persisted. Look at the monuments and the alignments that remain in stone. pyramids oriented with astonishing precision, megalithic rings aligned to solstices, temples laid out so that particular constellations touch their sanctuaries on certain nights of the year. These are not idle details. They suggest a knowledge of the sky and an intention to fix that knowledge into the very geometry of the built world. When we compare the configuration of monuments across continents, the resemblance is uncanny. It is as though the same set of questions: how will the sky betray us? How can we mark time so that future generations remember? How can we anchor knowledge in stone? Was posed in many places and answered with similar solutions. That resemblance is not necessarily proof of a single culture's transmission across oceans. It might be a shared human response to a shared environment. When the world is unpredictable, people anchor themselves to the sky and to durable forms. There is one tablet among many that carries a striking illustration of how human memory can be structured around catastrophe. It is a list of kings, a bureaucrat's ledger in its tone, that opens with impossible numbers. Reigns measured in tens, of thousands of years, rulers whose names come at the head of epochs. Then, like a punctuation in the middle of a sentence that has become too long, the list changes. After a stark phrase, the flood swept over. The durations of kings shrink into the realm we recognize. Centuries, decades. What are we to make of such a sudden division? Some interpret it as allegory, a symbolic compression of seasons and cycles into numbers that are meaningful within a culture's mathematics. Others read it as memory, a record of a former age with different conditions of life. Both interpretations tell us something crucial, that there is a boundary in memory, a before and an after, and the boundary is experienced as a rupture. That rupture has shaped consciousness since people first began to inscribe their history. If the ancients aligned their calendars and their stones to the sky, they did so because the stars were not merely decorative. The stars were instruments of timekeeping. To watch the motion of a constellation over a lifetime was to see a slow clock move. For societies that lived on human scales measured against agricultural seasons, forecasting celestial cycles was a kind of survival technology. If the heavens seemed to change, if a certain constellation's rise no longer matched planting, seasons, or if a bright object appeared where none had been known, that discrepancy would be a cause for dread as much as curiosity. Imagine an age where the appearance of a bright, unfamiliar object in the sky preceded storms that disrupted harvests, or where the once familiar arc of the Milky Way no longer matched the markers set in stone centuries before. Such shifts would be interpreted not as random accidents but as meaningful, as portents. The rituals that grew up around them, offerings, temple rebuildings, the construction of new calendars, would be less superstition than a practical communal response to unpredictability. The physical world offers us evidence for the scale of these changes. Ice cores reveal abrupt layers, quick transitions in the record of dust and isotopes. Sea level reconstructions show sudden rises that overwhelm coastlines. Fossil beds demonstrate species dying out or rapidly migrating in response to newly inhospitable climates. In places like Göbekli Tepe, where carved pillars predate settled agriculture, we encounter the unnerving possibility that monumental architecture preceded the social arrangements we attribute to city building. Temples that encode celestial events suggest that anticipatory knowledge was part of their reason for being. The idea that some societies may have preserved warnings in myth and monument, not out of ceremony but out of necessity, changes the way we read ancient culture. It is no longer merely curiosity to ask whether art and architecture once served as repositories of survival knowledge. It becomes urgent. And yet the human reaction to cataclysm is not only defensive, it is also creative. The collapse of a system, of a climate regime or a coastline, does not always annihilate knowledge. Often that knowledge adapts, migrates, and reforms. Technologies lost on one shore appear in a different form inland. Myths recombine into new genealogies, and a future age, lacking the continuity of libraries and continuous record-keeping, discovers fragments and imagines them whole. From our vantage, that discontinuity can look like regression, but it can also be the seedbed of new innovation. From catastrophic loss can come a burst of reinvention. New forms of agriculture, novel tools, new social contracts. The continuity lies not simply in objects, but in processes, in the capacity of human groups to reinterpret the past in ways that meet present need. If memory is unmoored, it becomes compressed into symbols. We find this again and again. A goddess who once may have represented a seasonal river becomes a figure of protection in a later pantheon. A folk tale about a great ship and a saved lineage becomes the model for laws that re-establish order after chaos. The transmission is rarely clean. Details are lost, meanings slough off, and the later world reads these compressed forms as myth or religion. Yet within those compressed forms, there may be technical residues. A story that, when unpacked, reveals a knowledge of sea routes, of astronomical cycles, of agricultural timing. For a later interpreter who has the benefit of archaeology, those residues become clues. For an ordinary listener in the ancient world, they were ritual, a way of living with the past that was both spiritual and practical. There is, too, an uncomfortable possibility that rises from the cross-section of myth and science, that the cycles themselves are not purely climatic, but can be amplified by celestial events. Large-scale shifts in the planet's electromagnetic shield, the magnetic field that protects us from cosmic radiation, appear in the record as excursions or temporary collapses. When the field weakens, the planet is more exposed to charged particles, which can spark atmospheric changes and perhaps contribute to a cascade of regional catastrophes. Solar activity follows its own periodicities, and we inhabit the sun's flux, like a plant inhabits the seasonal swing of daylight. These processes are not the stuff of apocalyptic fantasy. They are physical phenomena with enormous consequences when they coincide or when they interact with pre-existing vulnerabilities in continental ice or coastal configurations. So when the ancients wrote about the heavens as agents of change, they may have been recording, in their own idiom, observations of a world that sometimes behaves like a system close to tipping. They lacked our instruments, but they had long memories, attentive eyes, and a cultural imperative to record what would matter to the next generation. Their monuments are not merely the vanity of elites. They are the result of communal investment in forms designed to outlast catastrophe. The same stones that align with solstices act as anchors for social memory. If the knowledge encoded there was intended as warning, then its language was deliberately durable. Geometry, orientation, proportion. Those are things less vulnerable to the vagaries of language than a text is. They speak to any future that can look up and measure. There is an ethical gravitas in understanding the past as cyclical rather than linear. To read history as looped is to locate ourselves in a series of inheritances that include both the achievements and the blind spots of our predecessors. It suggests responsibility, not only for accumulation of knowledge, but for vigilance about how we maintain and transmit it. If our era is part of a long series of cycles, then our innovations in agriculture, in technology, in governance, are gifts that should be curated and laid down in durable forms, not only as ephemeral convenience. It also alters how we interpret failure. A failed city is not a mere ruin. It is an argument with the future about what must be remembered and why. This does not require us to accept myth as literal chronology. What it asks is that we read myth as a different medium of record-keeping. Symbol and metaphor are devices for compressing experience into communicable form. A narrative about gods pouring water over the world could encapsulate a memory of glacial melt, not by describing ice chemistry, but by giving the event an effective shape that makes sense to human beings. A story of the sun growing dim could be the memory-encoded shorthand for a spike in volcanic aerosol, or a major solar event that altered the daylight spectrum. Once we see myths as such, the gulf between ancient record and modern science narrows. Both inform each other by translating across modes. We owe the ancients the patience to decode their metaphors, and the humility to accept that our instruments, while powerful, cover only a fraction of the kinds of change Earth can undergo. In the strata of our planet, there are signatures we do not yet fully understand. And in the archives of human memory, there are cautions that look alarmist until the data accumulates. The wheel turns, and with each turn, it offers a choice to the creatures who occupy its rim, to learn and inscribe, or to assume that the present is permanent because it is visible. The first chapter of our story ends not with an answer, but with an invitation. To look beyond the arrogance of believing that our time is unique, and to see instead that we are participants in a longer sequence. This is not a fatalistic or fatalist perspective. It is an enlargement of scale that makes survival less a matter of hubris and more a practice of stewardship. As the planet's rhythms continue their patient, inexorable arc, humanity cannot pretend itself exempt. We may be inventors of astonishing systems and technologies, but the question remains whether we have the wisdom to place, deliberately and visibly, a record that will speak across catastrophe, a record that will allow those who come after us, whether 10 years or 10,000 years hence, to find the thread we are now knitting. Before the flood, people built as if to be remembered. After the flood, those memories became the scaffolding for new orders. In the space between collapse and reconstruction, the human story repeats a set of gestures: fear, creativity, ritual, and the slow invention of institutions that can hold a memory. To see the pattern is not merely to trace a curiosity in the archive. It is to see the possibility of another future in which knowledge is intentionally conserved in ways that survive extremes. That is a project at once humble and grand. Humble because it requires patience and humility about what we think we know, and grand because it reimagines the work of civilization as an intergenerational covenant. The wheel will turn again. The record will be written in new ways. The question is whether the message we leave, the stones we shape, the stories we tell, the data we preserve, will be a beacon or a whisper. Dreams of History has set itself the modest ambition of listening, of translating, and of placing those whispers back where they belong, into the long conversation between Earth and human, disaster and repair, forgetting and remembering. Before the flood, there were people who arranged the world with intention. They planted monuments as if staking out memory against disappearance. They measured the arc of the heavens as if the sky itself were evidence, and they set stories to repeat the lessons of catastrophe. To walk through the remains of those places is to feel the aftertaste of an older confidence, a conviction that certain truths could be fixed into stone, that knowledge could be made durable enough to survive storms, sea, and the slow erasure of human institutions. This is the story of those builders, of the strange sophistication that appears early and often across the globe, and of what those designs tell us about the age before the flood. Imagine a plain where men and women gather not to trade grain, but to shape meaning. Around fires they mark the rising of a particular star. With stone and labour, they erect circles and pillars whose shadows speak in a calendar only the patient can read. Somewhere in Anatolia, groups of people gathered long before cities appear on any map and raise circles of carved stone that do not simply celebrate ritual, but encode a kind of collective observation. The stones remember the sky for those who would come after, because the sky itself had begun, in the memory of people who lived by it, to change in dangerous ways. These early architects, call them ritualists, engineers, or memory keepers, built on scales that challenged the assumptions of later historians. In some places, they raised foundations heavy enough to outlast centuries of weather. In others, they aligned chambers to specific solar events with a precision that demands both mathematic skill and patient observation. Consider structures that predate full-scale agriculture, but display architectural plans involving deliberate geometry. circles, alignments, repeating modules that suggest an aesthetic of recurrence and repetition. The labor invested in such architecture implies organization, and organization implies a social intelligence intent on preserving what mattered. The observation that the world moved in patterns that could be tracked and, in a sense, prepared for. We often read the sequence of human development as linear, bands, villages, cities, but the archaeological record nudges us toward a more mosaic view. In places like southern Mesopotamia, where the first cities coalesce into sprawling urban landscapes, we also find evidence of earlier, possibly more mobile forms of high competence, people who understood irrigation, metallurgy, and long-distance exchange at levels that strain expectations. Their knowledge appears both in the technical traces of craft and in the symbolic systems they left behind, lists, calendars, and administrative tablets that insist on a bureaucracy of memory. The presence of such records implies that people were already trying to institutionalize knowledge, turning the ad hoc into the archived, before the social structures we associate with civilization were fully consolidated. There is a paradox here. The more successful a society is at organizing, the more vulnerable it can become to sudden changes. A city optimized for a particular river regime is exquisitely efficient until that river stops behaving in the way the planners expected. A coastline abundant with harbors becomes a liability when the sea rises beyond the harbor's protective reach. Because so much of the pioneer innovation of the first cities was built to fit a specific climate geometry. Canals, seasonal planting, temple economies. When that geometry shifted, the consequences were immediate and often catastrophic. The memory of these abrupt failures is the seed of the mythic flood. Not merely an allegory, but the compressed narration of a lived, abrupt change in the environmental assumptions that sustained a society. And yet, the record is not one of total nothingness. When catastrophe occurs, human groups do not always simply vanish. They migrate, adapt, and carry fragments of their craft with them. A pottery style found under silt in one coastline appears, decades later, in deposits far inland. Metalworking techniques seem to surface in regions separated by ocean or desert. This suggests networks of exchange and a diffusion of technical knowledge that complicates simple narratives about isolated invention. The idea of a single lost civilization as a discrete, monolithic entity gives way to a view of multiple, interacting centers of competence, nodes in a web that occasionally fray under stress but can also reknit in new patterns. Those who study ancient calendars and the geometry of monuments find a common problem that presumptively unites these builders. They feared oblivion. To ensure continuity, they encoded their most important knowledge in forms difficult to miswrite or misinterpret. An alignment to the solstice is an instruction that can be read by any culture that still observes the sun. A durable mathematical proportion, embodied in the relation of one measurement to another, is a language indifferent to particular vocabularies. Put differently, the ancients created redundancies. They dispersed knowledge across media, stone, story, temple, and ritual, so that the loss of one medium would not destroy the message. It is a conservative engineering of culture, and it suggests a world in which memory itself was a technology. The kings and priests who oversaw such projects played a role that combined the administrative with the sacred. They were custodians of both grain and myth. Where a city kept records of harvests, it also kept lists of ceremonial times. Where an elite commanded labor for a monument, it also preserved a calendar of ritual. This mingling of the practical with the sacred is not accidental. Rituals provide cohesion. Calendars coordinate labor. Temples anchor knowledge. When that web is torn by flood, fire, or the slow migration of the shoreline, the surviving parts are those redundancies. Thus, a myth can function as a durable archive. A flood story embedded in ritual can transmit crucial procedural memory: how to recognize a rising season, where to move flocks, which seed lines to favor, without the community needing a literate bureaucracy intact. What, Then, of the tools themselves, the evidence for metallurgy, navigation, and long-distance exchange in these early ages is both tantalizing and uneven. Bronze and early copper worked with a craftsmanship that implies know-how transmitted across generations. The presence of exotic materials, stones from distant quarries, shells from coasts far inland, signals long-distance trade that presupposes navigation, negotiation, and the capacity to maintain reciprocal relationships across unfamiliar terrain. Such capacities do not arise de novo. They are cumulative. This accumulation implies lifetimes of observation and practice, institutions that preserve technique, and social incentives to maintain specialized knowledge across time and upheaval. Maps, too, appear in fragments that confound simple periodization. When we examine early cartographic attempts, whether incised on clay or painted on hide, we find strikingly accurate renditions of coastlines and river courses in some cases, while in others, what looks like abstraction encodes a knowledge of travel and resource locations rather than a literal topography. The implication is not that these peoples had modern cartographic science, but that they had functional representations of space adequate for long-distance planning and memory. Those maps could be reinterpreted as allegory by later ages, which is why myth often contains kernels of navigational or hydrological fact wrapped in sacred narrative. Religious systems also played a role in the conservation of knowledge. Gods often embody ecological processes, rivers personified as deities, fertility tied to seasonal cycles, storms framed as acts of divine will. When the pattern of seasons is stable, those religious metaphors can appear purely symbolic. When the pattern shifts dramatically, those same metaphors become survival tools. A ritual that appears to an outsider as mere pageantry can function as a community-level algorithm. Sow at this sign, pull back at that one, move your flocks when such and such birds appear. This pragmatic reading of ritual does not diminish its spiritual dimension. Rather, it enriches our understanding of how sacred practices and survival strategies were braided together. And because people encoded warnings in ritual and stone, the survivors of a catastrophic event could point to those encodings to say, "This is what we must not forget." But encoding is always selective. What is chosen to be preserved reflects power and contingency. A priesthood might preserve astronomical calculations while neglecting local botanical knowledge, or a polity might invest in temple architecture rather than in small, mobile technologies more resilient to displacement. The choices of what to preserve have consequences. They shape what future societies inherit and what they imagine they have lost. This accounts, in part, for the different kinds of discontinuity we see across the archaeological record. Some things survive because their guardians chose them. Others are irretrievably lost because they were judged less worthy of permanence. In the broader register, there are traces that suggest a deep and widely distributed technological competence before the great breaks in the record. Consider the sophistication of early water management in lowland river systems. Canal networks, weirs, and catchment strategies that show a cumulative understanding of hydrology, or the early use of astronomical observation for agricultural planning, which required generations of recorded watching and measurement. These are not the intuitive accomplishments of itinerant bands, but the enduring products of communities that had developed the institutional frameworks to carry technical knowledge across generations. The social architectures that permitted such continuity are themselves worthy of attention. They were not merely political hierarchies. They were networks of apprenticeship, ritual obligation, and reciprocal labor. Knowledge transmission relied on mentorships and guild-like structures in which skills were taught by example over long periods. This depth of training implies a social expectation of continuity. The masters expected that the next generation would live in the same environment and so preserve and extend the master's craft. It is this assumption, when broken by rapid environmental change, that forces profound cultural recalibration. To survive, a people must either hold on to the memory in a different mode, myth, ritual, monument, or adapt their social institutions to new ecological realities. When adaptation fails at scale, survivors often reorganize identity in ways that obscure continuity. New myths arise, founding fathers are invented, and genealogies are rewritten. The narrative of origin becomes a device for social cohesion, erasing uncomfortable discontinuities. Yet beneath the surface, the new society may hold technical residues of the old, a particular alloying technique, a crop varietal, a ritual of seafaring. For the attentive archaeologist, these residues are the fingerprints of a story told imperfectly across time. They are small proof that the break was less total than we might assume. It is tempting, at this point, to romanticize the builders of the age before the flood as somehow closer to nature or more spiritually attuned than later peoples. That would be an error. They were pragmatic in ways we often underestimate. Their temple calendars regulated labor, their monuments anchored seasonal signaling, their networks distributed risk. But there is also an unmistakable strain of existential urgency running through their artifacts, as if the deep time awareness of recurring catastrophe had transformed technical competence into a species of cultural prudence. We need to consider what it meant, in human terms, to live under the expectation that the environment might change abruptly. It would create a certain temporal ethics. Plan for a future you will not personally enjoy. Invest in knowledge that will be read by those who come after you, and practice restraint when necessary to sustain a community through cycles of abundance and scarcity. This ethic is visible in the forms of institutional memory, in the dedication to building durable infrastructure, in the effort to transmit technical rituals, and in the ritualization of procedural knowledge. Those are the features that allowed some collections of people to reconstitute civilization more quickly after calamity than others. And yet, our modern vantage gives us an additional instrument, the ability to see patterns across wide stretches of time, to overlay geological data with mythic motifs, and to hypothesize mechanisms that connect celestial behavior with terrestrial outcomes. Even so, humility is required. The ancients did not lack intelligence. They lacked our instruments. In compensation, they had long memory and practical redundancy. Their solutions were artisanal and communal, not calculative in the way modern technocracy imagines. That difference is instructive. It suggests that resilience is not merely technological sophistication, but a cultural strategy that embeds redundancy and preserves procedural knowledge in multiple forms. As we move from the builders to the moment of rupture, the flood, that washes away one order and opens the possibility for another, the interplay between memory and catastrophe becomes the central drama of human experience. The builders lived with the tension between the need to make durable artifacts of knowledge and the fragility of any single social arrangement. Their monuments are not obelisks to pride. They are messages in a bottle designed to outlast the storm. The question they posed to the future was less about legacy than about survival. Can we speak across catastrophe? Will the forms we build be legible to those who come after the break? Their answer in the end is what we inherit now, a mosaic of hints, half-understood instructions, and mythic redundancies. From those we attempt to reconstruct not only the technical contours of earlier ages, but the moral project that animated them, an insistence that knowledge was worth saving, that the future was worth waiting for, and that human communities could be architects of continuity in a world that periodically forgets. The work of the next chapter is to watch that forgetting become action, to see how an age of builders, with their maps and measurements and crafts, confronted the approaching end, and how some of them attempted, in the face of overwhelming force, to leave something behind that would matter. The wind that once carried the smell of harvest now carries the scent of salt. Rivers swell beyond their banks, shorelines creep inland. What had been a plain becomes a lake. What had been a city becomes reflection. People begin to mark the change first with wonder, then with fear. In the first years it seems like bad luck, an unseasonal storm or a few lost crops. In the next generation, it is an unanswerable pattern. The sky feels heavier, the air thicker, The sun itself seems to pulse with a strange ferocity, its heat arriving in fits and surges that no one can predict. Records kept in temples show strange tides and constellations slipping slightly from their places. And then, too quickly for writing to catch up, the horizon begins to dissolve. The builders who had watched the sky now watch it, betray them. They consult the stones that once served as calendars, but the shadows fall where they should not. The days do not match the seasons. The river's flood no longer comes when the priests say it will. Crops wither in the fields, while the fish drown in their own shallows. The great cities that had drawn their identity from stability, stone walls, permanent markets, gods who never moved, discover that permanence was an illusion. The pattern they had tried to remember is no longer a memory. It is happening again. In one city, a council gathers under the roof of a temple whose columns still smell of cedar. They debate not belief, but survival, how to move food, how to keep the granaries dry, how to calm the people. Outside, rain falls for 40 days without pause. In another, priests climb the ziggurat and light torches to call back the sun. The torches are drowned by lightning. The flood does not arrive as a single wall of water. It comes as months of rain, then years of rising. The earth itself seems to shift, pulling rivers into new beds, grinding mountains into valleys. The builders who had understood alignment understand that alignment is over. The world is unmaking its own geometry. Those who survive do so not through faith or heroism, but through accident and instinct. Families flee uphill carrying tablets that soften into mud in the rain. Whole libraries disintegrate. Some climb to caves and carve what they remember into stone, lists, songs, stars. Others follow the receding edges of ice and find lands they have never seen before. Lands that will one day be remembered as the cradle of later peoples. The sound of the flood becomes the new silence. Generations will be born to it, and they will not remember a time when the world was quiet. When the waters begin to withdraw, the land they reveal is not the land that had been lost. Coastlines are unrecognizable. The soil smells of salt and rot. There are bones in the silt. Animals, people, pillars from temples. Survivors emerge like seeds after a fire, stunned by daylight. They name the world again, give new words to the same rivers, the same mountains, though they are different now. They invent gods to explain what has happened, because the old gods have drowned. The new pantheons are full of memories turned to symbols. A sky father with lightning in his hands, a sea mother who both gives and takes, a messenger who crosses between life and death. These are not inventions but translations. The stories remember what the people can no longer describe directly. Everywhere, the same gestures repeat. A woman marks the edge of the new water with stones, counting the days it stays. A man climbs a hill each morning to see whether the sun rises where it used to. Children learn to sing the names of stars that no longer appear, because the adults believe that speaking them will bring them back. In their small acts of remembrance lies the blueprint of future civilizations. They begin to rebuild not by reclaiming the old cities, but by adapting to the new contours of the earth. Where seaweed clings to ruined towers, fishermen learn new routes. Where the flood cut deep channels, farmers plant seeds in fresh sediment. Life persists, and with it, the impulse to measure, to mark, to make meaning. Centuries pass before the silence of survival gives way to the murmur of organization. Villages grow around the high grounds that escape the worst of the water. Tools improve, stories lengthen, and memory begins to harden into myth. The people remember that there was once a time when the earth turned against them. They no longer recall the details, the magnetic fields, the melting ice, the solar pulse. But they recall that arrogance brings ruin, that time moves in circles, and that everything that seems eternal is temporary. The flood becomes morality. The flood becomes explanation. It is the hinge of every story. When archaeologists of a later age uncover the strata of silt and char, they read it as data. But within that data lives the same fear and wonder that animated the songs of the survivors. The Great Flood, for all its devastation, did not end humanity. It reset the conditions of the possible. It humbled civilizations that had believed they could master time and nature. It forced the species to remember what it had nearly forgotten, that the Earth is not a stage built for our drama, but a living system that writes and erases without preference. In the centuries after the waters recede, the survivors' descendants will begin to call themselves first farmers, then kings. They will build again, using the stones of drowned temples as foundations. They will invent writing to record trade and tribute, unaware that they are repeating gestures thousands of years old. Their myths will whisper of an earlier world where gods walked among men, of a paradise lost, of a flood that cleansed and renewed. Those myths are not errors. They are the memory of the Great Reset, translated into the language of rebirth. And so history begins again, not as a new story, but as the continuation of an older one whose earlier pages have been washed clean. The cycle turns and the earth breathes out. What was drowned becomes soil. What was forgotten becomes legend. In the light of the new dawn, the survivors look out at a landscape that feels both alien and holy. They do not know that they are the children of a pattern older than memory. They only know that the world has begun once more. When the water finally surrendered, it left behind a silence so deep that the air itself seemed afraid to move. Hills that had been islands glistened with salt. Rivers cut new paths through soft mud. The survivors stood on unfamiliar ground, barefoot, carrying only what their hands could hold and what their minds could remember. The sky was wider now, emptier, as though the flood had rinsed the heavens as well as the earth. They began to walk, to test the new terrain, to name what the water had erased. Where a city once stood, they found shells. Where a mountain had been, a valley now opened. The world had rearranged itself, and they, the few who remained, had to learn it again. At first, they remembered by doing. They built fires and placed stones around them, repeating the old patterns without knowing why. They sang songs to measure distance, to keep rhythm, to drive away the fear of too much quiet. The songs became instruction. This plant heals, that star rises when the rains return. These animals travel before the storms. In the absence of libraries and tablets, memory lived in the body. In gesture, melody, routine, to eat, to walk, to sing, was to remember. Over generations, the survivors' children grew curious about the relics still visible on the higher ground. Fragments of cut stone too large to have been made by their own tools, half-buried walls that led nowhere, carvings whose symbols no one could read. They touched those remnants as if touching the skin of a sleeping ancestor. Some believed the ruins were the homes of gods. Others thought they were warnings. Whatever they believed, they began to imitate them. The instinct to build reawakened. Even small settlements erected markers, simple piles of rock aligned with the horizon, so that the people could feel anchored to something larger than their hunger and their fear. As the centuries passed, the mud hardened, forests returned, and animals spread across the plains. New rivers carved steady beds, and the seas retreated to distant edges. The climate softened, allowing humans to linger, to plan, to think beyond the next meal. The sky filled again with predictable constellations, and slowly, cautiously, the descendants of the flood turned their eyes upward. The stars had shifted, but they still moved in patterns. Those patterns became calendars. The watchers of the sky became teachers, and their pupils became priests. With each night's observation, they rebuilt a map of time, curiosity and necessity braided together. To survive, they needed to track seasons. To worship, they needed meaning. The two became indistinguishable. Rituals formed around observation, fires lit on the longest night, dances when a particular star rose before dawn. These acts were both prayer and science. The priests might not have known that they were measuring axial tilt or solstice, but they knew that repeating the same ritual on the same day each year kept the world coherent. The heavens became a mirror in which they could see order restored. In the silt of their memories remained fragments of the time before the flood, stories of light that destroyed, of gods who turned away, of a golden age drowned by arrogance. Those stories served as moral geometry, Stay humble. Remember the signs. Never forget that the earth can shift without warning. Over centuries, such memories hardened into scripture. Myths turned into systems of belief that structured new civilizations. The flood became the cornerstone of ethics and cosmology. What had once been survival advice now shaped empires. Stone returned as the favored medium of permanence. The builders who raised monuments after the flood were not merely imitating their ancestors. They were reasserting the idea that meaning could resist time. Across the recovering continents, massive temples began to rise again. On plateaus, near rivers, on the spines of mountains, each structure repeated an old impulse, to align the human with the cosmic. Some aligned to the rising sun, others to the courses of bright planets. Geometry became prayer. Architecture became philosophy. Through repetition, the world once more took shape. Trade followed curiosity. As populations grew, paths formed between the centers of rebuilding. Along those paths, ideas moved faster than goods. Travelers carried stories of distant lands where the floods had been gentler, or where the soil was black with new fertility. They spoke of stars that looked different when seen from other horizons, of winds that smelled unfamiliar, of mountains that hummed when struck. Out of such exchanges came the beginnings of a shared memory. The idea that humanity was one family scattered by catastrophe, now reassembling itself piece by piece. Tools improved. Clay hardened into pottery. Metal shimmered again in the hands of smiths who relearned the old arts by trial and error. The written mark reappeared, not as language at first, but as tally and record, as a way to remember beyond speech. On shards of clay, on bone, on bark, people inscribed symbols to count, to name, to own. In those scratches lay the first whispers of history's return. The flood had erased much, but it had not erased the instinct to record. At the same time, observers noticed other patterns. Ice retreated at the poles. New lands appeared where glaciers had been. Storms came in cycles, and sometimes, after decades of calm, the earth shuddered again. These signs stirred unease. Some priests whispered that the flood had been only one of many, that the world could turn once more. A few began to watch the sky not with hope, but with suspicion. They charted the behavior of the sun, the wandering of the poles, the tremors of the earth. What they found frightened them. Subtle changes that hinted the planet was not finished with its rhythms. They lacked our instruments, but they had intuition. They sensed that the stability they enjoyed was temporary, yet despite the fear, there was beauty. The rebuilt world shimmered with invention. Languages multiplied, art blossomed. Music filled the spaces where silence had once drowned everything. People learned to shape myth into metaphor rather than lore. They built not just to survive, but to express wonder. Out of trauma grew creativity. Out of loss grew empathy. The descendants of the flood became artists of memory. Generations later, as these new societies matured, some thinkers began to look beyond the rituals and stories that had sustained them. They began to ask what forces truly shaped their world. They studied shadows, seasons, and stars, and through careful reasoning began to glimpse patterns that echoed what the ancients had known but forgotten. The age of priests began to merge into the age of philosophers. Observation replaced invocation. Where once people prayed for the river to rise, now they measured its currents. The slow rebirth of science had begun, not as rebellion against the sacred, but as an extension of it. To understand the universe was to honor it. In their searching, they rediscovered truths that would one day be framed in our own vocabulary. That time has cycles, that the earth moves through them, that light and heat govern everything that lives. Their language was symbolic, their mathematics poetic, but the essence was the same. The first calendars evolved into instruments of prediction. By counting, by watching, by recording, they began to see the deeper pulse beneath change. The idea of rhythm returned, not as superstition, but as insight. And with that realization came a new anxiety. If the flood had been part of a pattern, then the pattern would, inevitably, repeat. The most observant among them could see small signs. A climate shifting again, stars drifting, the seasons hesitating. But rather than despair, some chose to prepare. They built higher, carved deeper, wrote more carefully. They taught that knowledge must be shared, not hoarded. They told their children that every empire is temporary, but wisdom can survive if carried in many forms. That idea became the hidden philosophy of the rebuilt world. The story of humanity after the flood is not only one of reconstruction, it is a story of rediscovery, of how the same curiosity that led the first watchers to track the stars re-emerged after ruin, proving that knowledge is not easily killed. Across continents and languages, the same refrain echoes. Remember the signs, honor the rhythm, and do not mistake stability for safety. The earth is generous but not tame. It breathes in long intervals, and each breath remakes the world. As the new civilizations flourish, the memory of the flood fades into legend. The cycle for a time seems broken, but beneath the comfort of progress, the same quiet pulse continues, patient and immense. One day, far beyond the horizon of their calendars, it will quicken again. The earth will inhale, and everything built since the last flood will tremble. For now, though, the survivors' descendants look to the horizon and see only dawn. The world, newly made, glows with promise, unaware that the rhythm that once drowned it is still keeping time. After many generations, when the fear of the flood had become a distant echo, the survivors' descendants looked at the sky not with terror, but with recognition. The stars had steadied, the seasons obeyed again, and the world seemed trustworthy. The first cities rose from mud and reed. People shaped clay into tablets, carved laws into stone, and began to measure not only the passing of days, but the rhythm of their own continuity. They were not the first civilization, though they believed they were. Beneath their feet, under layers of sediment and forgotten ruins, lay the bones and instruments of worlds older than they could imagine. What they built was both a beginning and a recovery. In the land between two rivers, scribes pressed reeds into wet clay to record the harvest, the movement of herds, the exchange of silver and barley. But in the margins of their tallies, they also noted eclipses, storms, and the strange wanderings of bright stars. Slowly, a connection formed. What happened in the heavens seemed to have consequence on earth. Out of this observation emerged calendars, omens, astronomy disguised as divination. To keep order, they created gods. Each god embodied an aspect of the world they wished to stabilize. The sky that flooded them with rain, the sun that burned their crops, the winds that carried both life and death. They personified patterns, giving faces and names to the laws of nature. In worshipping them, they remembered the old instruction, know the rhythms or perish by them. Temples became archives. Their walls were not merely for devotion but for data. Priests watched the sky from their roofs and wrote what they saw, repeating what their ancestors had once done before the flood erased the vocabulary of science. A new priesthood emerged, part astronomer, part historian. They did not call themselves scientists, yet they preserved the very methods of observation that had defined the earlier age. With each recorded cycle of Venus, each predicted eclipse, they re-established humanity's relationship with the cosmos. The notion that the heavens could be understood, that the universe operated under order, was the return of memory. Further west, along another river, builders raised stone against stone until geometry became worship. They aligned corridors to the rising of particular stars, carved ceilings into constellations, measured with such fidelity that even now their monuments hold the precision of an impossible clock. They too believed they were inventing civilization, but in their designs we can read recollection, the angles of their pyramids, the proportion of their temples, the symbolic mathematics in their art. These were echoes of an older comprehension, adapted to a new landscape. Their priests wrote hymns about gods descending from the sky, about knowledge delivered from beings of light who came before the first dynasty. Whether these beings were mythic metaphors or the cultural memory of lost mentors, the pattern remains. Wisdom survives catastrophe in the form of myth. Stories of divine kings, of beings who came from the stars or from the sea, appear across continents. In one version, the bringer of civilization rises from the ocean with fish scales on his skin, teaching language and law. In another, a shining teacher descends in a chariot of fire to measure the earth and instruct in the making of tools. To later ages, these would sound like tales of gods. But perhaps they were memories of ancestors who carried the fragments of pre-flood knowledge, migrants whose technologies seemed miraculous to those who had forgotten. The line between divinity and memory blurs when centuries of silence intervene. Language itself became the next monument. Written marks matured from simple counts to complex grammar. Ideas could now cross generations intact. For the first time since the flood, memory no longer depended entirely on the fragile vessel of human mind. Clay and stone became external storage, time's second spine. Through writing, memory detached from the individual and became property of the collective. Humanity had built a new way to remember itself. What had once been a species of rediscovery now became invention again. The more they remembered, the more they mythologized their remembering. Each civilization began to tell stories of a golden age, an era of perfect harmony broken by pride and disaster. The Sumerians wrote of kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years before a great deluge ended their line. The Egyptians spoke of the Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods walked with men. In the Andes, the tales of Viracocha mirrored those from Mesopotamia, a luminous teacher who rebuilt the world after it drowned. These parallel myths are not coincidences. They are fingerprints of the same trauma and the same attempt to make sense of it. As cities grew richer, the guardians of knowledge turned inward. The first libraries were born, collections of clay tablets arranged by subject, temple walls covered with lists and prayers and laws. There, under lamplight, a handful of scholars preserved star charts and flood records that stretched back farther than any king's reign. They began to see history not as a chain of events, but as a pattern of repetition. In some surviving fragments, we read of cycles, eras measured in tens of millennia, ages defined by catastrophe. Even after translation errors and losses, the structure of their timekeeping echoes the same interval, roughly 12,000 years between renewals. They did not know it with our mathematics, but they felt it in their myths. Elsewhere, wanderers carried these ideas beyond the river kingdoms, teaching crafts, seeding myths, building shrines where none had stood before. Every culture they touched adapted the message. The world renews itself. Knowledge must be carried forward. Humility is wisdom. Some encoded it in megaliths, others in story and song. From these cross-currents emerged a patchwork of civilizations, each believing itself new, but all participating in the same project, the restoration of memory. In time, a strange transformation occurred. The effort to remember became the foundation of identity itself. Dynasties justified their power through genealogy traced to gods. Priests interpreted the movement of planets as messages from eternity. The sacred and the scientific were no longer separate pursuits. They were one language spoken with different intentions. This unity of meaning produced both revelation and rigidity. What began as curiosity hardened into doctrine. Knowledge that had once been experimental became ceremonial. The memory that had been reborn risked becoming myth once more. Yet even within the constraints of ritual, certain minds continued to look outward. They noticed the slow drift of stars across generations, the faint irregularities in their motion, and the subtle signs that the sky itself was alive. They understood that what seems constant changes on scales too long for a single lifetime to measure. These were the ancestors of astronomers, the keepers of long cycles, the ones who kept count not for kings, but for time itself. Their legacy reached far beyond their lifetimes. Millennia later, when another age of inquiry dawned, their records became the bridge between myth and mathematics. Modern science would rediscover what they had intuited, that the Earth is a participant in cosmic cycles, that catastrophe and creation are parts of one process. Their myths were never nonsense. They were early algorithms, poetic data storage written in symbol and story. In the soft glow of ancient firelight, when a priest traced the path of Venus across the sky and murmured a hymn, he was performing both worship and measurement. He was, knowingly or not, renewing the covenant between memory and observation that defines humanity. Through him, the knowledge of those who came before the flood lived again, transformed but continuous. And through that continuity, the world regained its sense of rhythm. The flood had not erased everything. It had forced remembrance into hiding, waiting for the right moment to resurface. That moment had arrived. The wheel of time had turned once more, and humanity, without knowing it, had begun to remember the forgotten future. Across the centuries that followed, those memories did not remain confined to temple walls or the whisper of priests. They spread, transformed, and rooted themselves in every culture that rose from the dust. In the East, stargazers recorded the heavens on silk scrolls, mapping eclipses and comets with precision that still astonishes. In the West, philosophers began to question the shape of the earth, the nature of time, the invisible forces that bound the moon to the sea. Everywhere, the same impulse stirred, to understand what had once been lost, to find the rhythm behind the apparent chaos of existence. But for every seeker who looked to the sky for pattern, there were others who looked to the ground for power. Kingdoms rose on the back of the rediscovered sciences, geometry for their temples, metallurgy for their armies, writing for their decrees. Knowledge that had once been shared as sacred memory became property. Libraries turned to fortresses. The flow of wisdom slowed to a trickle guarded by those who claimed divine sanction. The old warning, do not forget, do not hoard, do not repeat the arrogance of the drowned, was recited as ritual and ignored in practice. The cycle had entered its middle phase, mastery without humility. Still, beneath that layer of ambition, the deeper current of remembrance continued. In the deserts, hermits traced spirals in the sand to mark the procession of equinoxes. In the mountains, astronomer priests built circles of stone that aligned perfectly with the sunrise of midsummer. These were acts of devotion, but they were also acts of calibration, of quiet vigilance. Some among them began to notice anomalies, subtle shifts in climate, changes in the tilt of light, storms that did not fit the pattern of their calendars. Their records, carved or written, hint at a growing unease. They speak of an age of warming, of strange auroras, of the sun behaving unpredictably. To them, it must have seemed as if the gods were stirring again. Elsewhere, on coasts and in fertile valleys, civilizations entered their golden ages. They perfected irrigation, invented new alphabets, built roads that connected seas to mountains. They sent ships beyond the horizon, and returned with stories of lands that defied the known maps. Trade carried ideas faster than armies, and the world for a time appeared bound together by a common pulse of progress. Yet under the brilliance of innovation lay the same flaw that had undone their ancestors, the belief that progress was permanent. A few voices tried to warn them. Old texts resurfaced, half legible, speaking of previous ages that had vanished under water or fire. Philosophers debated whether time was linear or circular. Some claimed the ancients had exaggerated. Others argued that memory itself proved the cycles were real. A handful began to see correspondences between the myths of different peoples. The flood stories, the celestial teachers, the great resets. They started to piece together what we now recognize as a pattern. But without instruments to prove it, their theories became allegories, their calculations transmuted into prophecy. In the north, the climate shifted once more. Crops failed, empires fractured, libraries burned, centuries of accumulated knowledge turned to ash. The pattern of ascent and collapse repeated, this time slower, more fragmented, less final, but just as telling. Each destruction was followed by renewal, each forgetting by a rediscovery. The rhythm continued, its tempo imperceptible to any single lifetime, but obvious to the long memory of the earth itself. The lineage of watchers, the ones who measured shadows, who counted years not in decades but in precessions, did not vanish. They adapted. In monasteries, in observatories, in hidden schools, they preserved fragments of ancient cycles. They watched the stars shift westward, noted the wobble of the planet's axis, felt the slow creep of magnetic drift. They saw what the ancients had seen and called it by new names. In their journals, we find the same realization dawning again and again. History is not a straight line, but a wheel. By the time humanity entered its modern age, the knowledge had been translated into mathematics and physics, stripped of myth, but not of meaning. We learned to measure ice cores, to read sediments, to trace the fingerprints of past cataclysms. We found evidence of sudden climate flips every 10 to 12,000 years. Layers of soot and ash, spikes of carbon and oxygen isotopes, fossils of forests drowned overnight. Each discovery confirmed what the earliest storytellers had encoded in legend. The world renews itself through destruction. The flood was never just one event, it was the heartbeat of the planet. And now, as our own age of technology expands beyond anything those early priests could imagine, the same signs appear again. Rising seas, shifting poles, storms that rewrite coastlines, heat that cracks the old rhythms of season. Satellites show the data. Prophets once sang the same message in another tongue. We stand at the crest of the cycle, facing the same choice every civilization before us has faced, to remember or to forget. Yet even in the noise of progress, the memory persists. A handful still watch the stars. They calculate the orbits, measure the ice, listen for the pulse beneath the data. They are not prophets or priests, but inheritors of the same ancient duty, to notice the pattern. The rest of us live as our ancestors did, believing that tomorrow will resemble today. But deep within the archives of both science and myth, the warning hums like a hidden frequency. Every 12,000 years, the balance tilts. Ice melts, fire awakens, and the oceans remember their paths. The earth breathes in and out, and in that breath civilizations are erased. What we call disaster, the planet calls renewal. For now, the sun rises, the tides obey, and the cities glitter as if the world were eternal. But under that illusion, the rhythm gathers strength. The same cycle that once drowned the first cities stirs again. We have time still, to learn, to adapt, to remember. Whether we will is the question that decides which fragments of us the next world will find, buried beneath its future layers of silt and stone. The memory of cycles now lives not in myth or song, but in data. Numbers that hum quietly behind our technologies, graphs that stretch across glowing screens, measurements taken by machines orbiting far above the Earth. They show us what the ancients intuited, that change is not chaos, but rhythm. Glaciers advance and retreat like breath. Oceans rise and fall like tides of centuries. Magnetic fields wander, weaken, flip. Species bloom, vanish, return in new forms. To the ancients, these were the acts of gods. To us, they are statistics. But the awe remains, even if unspoken. In laboratories, scientists study the cores of ice drawn from the poles. Each layer tells a story of warmth and cold, of dust and ash, of eruptions and silences. They can read, year by year, the pulse of the planet, and within that pulse they see a steady beat every 10 to 12 millennia. It is there in the sediments of the ocean floor, in the isotopes of carbon and oxygen, in the bones of animals that died suddenly in floods of meltwater. The evidence accumulates quietly, like sand filling a clock. We are approaching another turn. Some call it coincidence, others call it inevitability. A few whisper what the old priests once declared openly, that time itself is breathing again. As the planet warms, as the poles soften, as the magnetic north drifts across continents faster than maps can update, we are reminded that stability is a phase, not a right. Our civilization, vast and fragile, sits at the top of a long, narrow wave that has crested before. Beneath us are layers of forgotten worlds that once believed themselves permanent. In hidden institutes and private observatories, researchers compare their findings with ancient texts. The parallels are unnerving. Each time the planet shifts, something luminous happens first. An increase in cosmic radiation, auroras that dance across strange latitudes, bursts of energy from the sun. The ancients described them as lights of the gods, harbingers of flood or fire. We record them as solar flares, magnetic storms, coronal mass ejections. Different language, same phenomenon. The memory of the sky's warning was never superstition. It was observation wrapped in poetry. But even as data converges with myth, disbelief remains our most common defense. To accept that history resets is to accept impermanence, and impermanence threatens the story of progress. So we build higher, faster, louder. We dig deeper into the earth for metals. We reach farther into space for knowledge. We code our memories into machines that will outlast us. Or so we hope. Perhaps this too is a form of prayer, our way of carving meaning into the surface of time before the next tide comes. The watchers, those few who listen to the deeper pattern, do not speak of doom. They speak of continuity. To them, the coming shift is not punishment but transition, a renewal written into the planet's design. They gather in conferences, share models, and speak softly of adaptation, of how species and societies survive the breathing of the world. They know that when the great turning comes, it will not be a single event but a symphony. Climate, magnetism, ocean, sky, all changing measure together. In ancient temples, the walls told the same story in symbols, the serpent biting its own tail, the phoenix rising from its ashes, the wheel that spins forever. We still use these images without remembering why. They are reminders from the first civilizations to the last, that nothing ends without beginning, that memory is the bridge between destruction and creation. The flood, the fire, the ice, all are verses of one song. The question is no longer whether the cycle will repeat. It already has begun. Glaciers withdraw faster each decade. Storms rewrite coastlines. Forests burn in patterns visible from space. Yet even this is not the end. It is the overture of the next stage. The challenge is not to stop the rhythm, but to learn how to move with it, to carry forward what matters through the narrowing passage of change. Somewhere, in a darkened observatory, a scientist watches a flare leap from the sun and feels the same wonder a Sumerian priest once felt as he traced Venus across the dawn. Across thousands of years, the gestures are identical. Both are acts of remembrance. Both are humanity reaching toward understanding, knowing that the light we see now began its journey long before we were born. And so the cycle turns again, silently, elegantly, without malice. The earth breathes in, and civilizations hold their breath. The earth breathes out, and new worlds emerge. What will survive is what has always survived. The impulse to remember, to tell, to rebuild. The flood will come, as it always does, and after it, children will stand on the new shore, look at the sky, and wonder who built the ruins half buried beneath their feet. The rhythm continues, endless and indifferent, but within it lies the miracle of persistence, the knowledge that each age, even ours, is a single note in a song that has no final chord. In the quiet between storms, humanity learns to listen again. The noise of progress dims just enough for the deeper pulse to be heard. The soft, constant hum of a planet alive beneath its skin. Cities glitter like constellations. Networks hum. Machines whisper in languages built from numbers. But beneath all of it, something older stirs. The rhythm of water and wind, of gravity and sunlight, of life rising from ruin, returns to the foreground. We begin to sense that everything we have built is part of that rhythm, not separate from it. In laboratories, new instruments read the planet's breath more finely than any priest once could. Satellites track the heartbeat of forests, the migration of heat across oceans, the long exhale of carbon into the air. The data, when arranged across centuries, reveals the pattern unmistakably. Scientists call it feedback, resonance, periodicity. Poets call it fate, but both are describing the same truth. The cycle is not prophecy but physics, not punishment but participation. We are inside the mechanism we have spent millennia trying to understand. Some dream that technology will let us step outside of it, that by mastery of energy and matter we might finally escape the wheel that crushed our ancestors. Yet even as we reach for the stars, we carry the earth with us. The rhythms that shaped us are encoded in our cells, in our instincts, in the pulse of our hearts. To live is to oscillate, to rise and fall with the same hidden timing that moves the oceans. The illusion of permanence was never the world's lie. It was ours. A few voices have begun to say it aloud. Philosophers and scientists, artists and wanderers. They speak of a coming alignment between the biological and the technological, a convergence that might let consciousness persist beyond matter. But others, quieter, remind us that the true challenge is not survival of the individual, but continuity of meaning. The ancients tried to carve memory into stone. We etch it into silicon. Both are fragile in the long rhythm of the earth. Both will fade if the next generation forgets why they were made. Every era believes it stands at the edge of time. Ours has the evidence to make that feeling convincing. We watch glaciers melt in real time. We map storms from orbit. We record extinctions as data points. We know more than any civilization before us, yet the question remains unchanged. What will we choose to carry through the next transformation? Our buildings may crumble. Our networks fail. Our archives drown. But the pattern will continue, waiting for someone, somewhere, to listen again. There are signs of remembering already. Children planting forests in places their grandparents abandoned. Engineers designing machines that mimic the logic of rivers. Communities measuring success not by accumulation, but by endurance. The old wisdom is returning in a new form. Harmony disguised as innovation. Humility disguised as progress. The line between science and spirit begins to blur again, just as it did in the earliest temples. Once more, observation becomes reverence. Perhaps that is what the cycle demands of us. Not submission, but participation. The planet's renewal is inevitable. What remains uncertain is whether our renewal will accompany it. If we can learn to read the rhythm rather than resist it, to build not against the tides but with them, then memory will survive the next flood. Not as myth, not as warning, but as continuity. The watchers of this age stand in observatories and on shorelines, in laboratories and deserts. They are many now, and they share what they see in light-speed whispers across the world. Together, they are writing the next record of the Earth's breath. When future eyes uncover their work, buried in whatever new geology the planet has invented, perhaps they will understand that we tried, not to stop the wheel, but to turn with it more gracefully than before. Night falls. The cities shimmer. The oceans murmur their endless syllables against the land. Somewhere a child looks up, sees the same stars that guided the first builders, and feels the same question rising. Who built the world? And how long will it last? The answer, as always, is written not in the sky, but in the rhythm that connects all things. The earth breathes. We breathe with it. The cycle begins again, and the song continues. Soft, eternal, unfinished. And so the story folds into itself again. The flood becomes memory. Memory becomes myth. And myth becomes the quiet pulse of tomorrow. Each of us carries a fragment of that memory, written not in stone or code, but in the rhythm of our own breath. The earth remembers. And maybe that's all history really is. The planet dreaming of itself through us. If these stories moved you, if they made you wonder, then stay with us, because the next dream is already beginning. You've been listening to Dreams of History, where every ending is only the beginning of another forgotten future. Subscribe so that when the next cycle begins, you'll be here to remember it with us.